Imagine waking up one day to find that your entire way of life had been erased. Cities abandoned, schools closed, money worthless, and anyone who dared to resist, executed. This was the terrifying reality for millions of Cambodians under the rule of Pol Pot. From 1975 to 1979, his Khmer Rouge regime turned Cambodia into a nightmare, one of the most brutal genocides in human history. Pol Pot wasn't just a dictator, he was an architect of death. His vision of an agrarian communist utopia led to the deaths of around 1.7 million people, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population. Intellectuals, doctors, teachers, and even people who wore glasses were labeled as enemies and slaughtered. His policies of forced labor, mass executions, and starvation created a living hell for those who survived. Yet, unlike many other infamous dictators, Pol Pot never faced justice. He lived out his final days in the jungle, never answering for the suffering he caused. What drove a man to commit such atrocities? How did he rise to power, and how did he fall? This is the story of the most psychotic dictator in modern history, Pol Pot. Pol Pot was born as Saloth Sar in 1925 in Cambodia, which was then a French colony. Unlike many future dictators, his early life was privileged. His family was relatively well off, and he even studied at a Buddhist monastery. However, his true transformation began when he traveled to France in the late 1940s to study electronics. There, he was exposed to communist ideology, becoming deeply influenced by Marxist and Maoist teachings. After failing his studies, he returned to Cambodia in the early 1950s and joined the underground communist movement. Over time, he became a key figure in the Cambodian Communist Party, later known as the Khmer Rouge. During the 1960s, he and his followers waged a guerrilla war against the US-backed Cambodian government, slowly gaining support from rural peasants who resented government corruption. By the early 1970s, Cambodia was engulfed in civil war, further destabilized by US bombing campaigns against suspected communist bases. Seizing the opportunity, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge launched an aggressive push toward the capital. On April 17, 1975, they entered Phnom Penh victorious. The people expected peace, but instead, they stepped into one of the darkest chapters in human history. Pol Pot's vision for Cambodia was extreme and terrifying. He sought to create a classless agrarian society free from capitalism, modern influences, and even personal identity. Inspired by Maoist ideas, he believed that urban life, education, and foreign influence had corrupted Cambodian society. His solution? Erase everything and start from year zero. To achieve this, he ordered the complete evacuation of cities, forcing millions of people into the countryside to work as laborers. Money, private property, and religion were abolished. Intellectuals, former government officials, and even those who spoke foreign languages were labeled as enemies and executed. Pol Pot believed that the only way to achieve his utopia was through absolute control and terror. He saw mass killings, forced labor, and starvation as necessary sacrifices to purify the nation. His ideology wasn't just extreme, it was psychotic. When the Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia in April 1975, they wasted no time in implementing Pol Pot's radical vision. Within days, Phnom Penh and other cities were emptied as millions were forced into the countryside. Sick, elderly, and disabled individuals were forced to march alongside everyone else. Those who refused were executed on the spot. Under Pol Pot's rule, Cambodia became a massive forced labor camp. People were ordered to work up to 18 hours a day in brutal conditions, with little food and no medical care. Families were separated, and any form of individualism was seen as a betrayal of the state. Even expressing grief over a lost loved one could lead to execution. Religion, education, and culture were completely banned. Buddhist monks were killed, temples destroyed, and books burned. Western medicine was outlawed, and thousands died from treatable illnesses. The Khmer Rouge's paranoia grew rapidly. Anyone suspected of disloyalty was arrested, tortured, and killed. One of the most infamous places was Tuol Sleng, a former high school turned into a torture prison. Here, thousands of people were brutally interrogated before being sent to the killing fields, where they were executed. Bullets were considered too expensive, so many victims were bludgeoned to death with farm tools. By the end of Pol Pot's rule, Cambodia was unrecognizable. Millions were dead, and the survivors were broken, starving, and living in constant terror. But the horrors were far from over. Under Pol Pot's rule, Cambodia experienced one of the worst genocides in history. His regime targeted anyone who was seen as a threat to his vision of a communist utopia. Intellectuals, teachers, doctors, religious figures, and even people who wore glasses were singled out for execution. Ethnic minorities, including Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cham Muslims, were brutally persecuted. The killing fields became the final resting place for millions. Victims were brought to mass execution sites, blindfolded, and forced to kneel before being killed with blunt objects, machetes, or even sharpened bamboo sticks. Infants were smashed against trees to ensure no enemies were left behind. The Khmer Rouge saw mass murder as a necessary tool for their revolution. But executions were not the only cause of death. Millions perished from starvation and disease due to the regime's disastrous agricultural policies. Farmers were forced to grow unrealistic rice quotas, and failure to meet them often resulted in execution. Meanwhile, many starved as food was either exported or left to rot. The Khmer Rouge's paranoia led to endless purges. Even their own members were not safe. Thousands of suspected traitors within the party were tortured and executed in Tuol Sleng prison. The regime operated on fear, silencing opposition with relentless brutality. By 1979, nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population had been wiped out. The suffering was unimaginable, but finally, the horrors of Pol Pot's rule would come to an end. Pol Pot's brutal reign finally collapsed in 1979 when Vietnam invaded Cambodia. The Khmer Rouge, weakened by internal purges and failing policies, was no match for the Vietnamese military. Within weeks, Phnom Penh was liberated, and Pol Pot fled into the jungle. Despite losing power, he continued to lead remnants of the Khmer Rouge in guerrilla warfare for nearly 2 decades. Even as the world condemned his crimes, he evaded justice. In 1997, after a power struggle within the Khmer Rouge, he was placed under house arrest by his own followers. A year later, he died in his sleep, escaping the trial and punishment he deserved. Today, Pol Pot is remembered as one of the most psychotic dictators in history. The scars of his genocide remain in Cambodia, with survivors still grappling with the trauma he inflicted. His reign serves as a haunting reminder of what unchecked power and radical ideology can do. Thank you for watching. Do you agree that Pol Pot is the most psychotic dictators? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel.